Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Asiago, known through other names such as the Südtirol Offensive, the Battle of the Plateau, in Italian Battaglia degli Altipiani, or Strafexpedition, an unofficial name as we'll see now that was used to highlight the general Austro-Hungarian sentiments towards the Italians. At this point, during World War I, we're essentially looking at the 1916 spring offensive into Italy, into Trentino. One of actually the most interesting operations of the war that happens in parallel, and we will see this because it has very interesting implications between Italy, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. During the Verdun offensive that I made a video on a couple of weeks ago, we never talked about the Alpine front in World War I. It's a secondary one by the same mountainous nature of the theater. Nevertheless, it's secondary just to, of course, the major Western one, and obviously radically intertwined with the same for a number of reasons that are not just strategic but political. We will essentially make this pretty long analysis as an introduction, also generally speaking, to Italy and Austria-Hungary in this time of the war, and growing more familiar with it because, as you know, I'm expanding into contemporary warfare, and I think World War I is one of the most beautiful, of course, military historical topics that deserve a lot of consideration. I would say there are many misconceptions, at least in a broader stereotypical sense, about the Alpine front that does not deserve, considering the scale of it, nevertheless, the adequate attention throughout all the course of the war. I think for how pop culture, as always, that's my alibi, my excuse to say who does think that. Well, in general, I don't think there is a great, again, understanding of many aspects of both Austro-Hungarian and Italian military history that, in fact, as you know, I focus on to some degree, even more, just to compensate this gap. A lot of stuff to untangle here because we're not looking just at the offensive per se. It was a pretty big thing, but all that came with that in terms of the commanders' capacities, the general strategic background, and also the doctrinal one, which, as you know, for World War I is sort of a evergreen and hot topic, considering what these powers should or should have not done. The better thing is to actually learn what would occur. So first of all, this spring, I don't know how to conventionally call it. I would say the Altipiani offensive or the Strafexpedition, if you prefer. I would just say now we're talking about this Austro-Hungarian offensive, so I will not be repeating that, even though, of course, Austro-Hungarian is also not out there for the sake of brevity, but we understand here between Italy and Austria-Hungary there are no other actors involved, in at least for the focus of this analysis. And we should start from the fact that this offensive, say better, because the only one we're talking about today, was initially considered unfeasible by figures of the caliber of von Falkenhayn, that, as you know, was the German commander-in-chief that exactly for 1916 needed all forces available, and that was not really convinced by the Austro-Hungarian plan of this Trentino offensive, and that in fact would bring to a very similar outcome in comparison to the Battle of Verdun. Naturally, in very different context, but still the same month, right? There was an underestimated risk, and part of this stemmed from cultural, national, and even anthropological conceptions that were pretty much typical of the time. Rampant nationalism, ethnicism, well, not racialism, the Austro-Hungarian, hatred towards the nascent, let's say, Italian power in areas that had historically been controlled by the Habsburgs. In fact, a new generational attitude that had not existed up to a few generations before. Really, the age of the nation state changed a big deal of things in perception of European peoples within themselves. There is all a previous Italian, Austrian military history that would be very interesting to cover, as a matter of fact, and we will, of course, delve also into the 19th century in some other video. This also starts, of course, being very intertwined with basically the entirety of the continental, well, not the world balance of power. All right, so that what happens in this apparently secondary front is actually a huge deal, and the 1916 Austro-Hungarian offensive is definitely a major deal. The Austro-Hungarians essentially are advancing into Italy, but the environmental challenges would prove more formidable than expected. Its strategy was uncertain, if not flawed, and especially the Italian response catches the invader off guard. Right? When you look at the overall picture, to make long story short, the Italian military was significantly unbalanced in deployment for obvious reasons. Right? The vast majority of troops was concentrated on the Isonzo front, so in northeastern Italy, where the Italians were on the offensive, thinking to be able, offensive after offensive, to break through at some point, essentially entering into Ulster because of the major, say, orographic, barrier that essentially separated the Italian army from the enemy heartland. You know that the Isonzo offensives have become almost a meme of, say, stubbornness when not of, gigantic waste of human life. It's a bit the same myth of the butchers that you find basically all over, our, again, pop culture, that does not understand how important by scale these offensives really were. This is not about breaking the front per se at any given offensive, but of course depleting enemy forces and especially pinning them down to the extent of essentially preventing a major imbalance on the Western Front, as we will see now, the Italian siding with the Entente rather than the previously subscribed alliance with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire had been a major deal in that balance. I also have some videos incoming on the Schlieffen Plan, so-called Schlieffen Plan, and the role of Italy in that is somehow overlooked. That is always the case. Like both in World War II and World War I, there's the sense that the Italian forces were somehow scarce, and that the Italian fronts were fundamental, wherever they were fighting, were somehow irrelevant to the broader picture. This is actually a deep misunderstanding of the entire conflicts. That, in fact, military historians have begun to basically heavily repent, at least for the sins of those who had preceded them, because it's actually crucial to the entire picture. And of course, this front risked at different times to break from a side or the other during the war. And the Italians did seem the weaker side, but they were. It was a front that, because of its mountain warfare, had incredibly particular dynamics that I think are very well highlighted also by the Battle of the Altipiani. And so this is obviously the idea. You can defend. This is really easy to see in throughout all of Europe, wherever positional warfare occurred, and especially mountain warfare. Right? If you are sort of worried of what the Italians did on the Isonzo front, just know that the Austro-Hungarians did the same identical thing in Montenegro. That is to say, they basically attacked repeatedly the enemy positions until the defenders ran out of ammo, literally. And so this was the only way to go. There was no other way to make war. Like, the alternative to the Isonzo offensive was not to enter the war. this was the only way. And if you look at the actual scale of losses from both sides, of course, the notion that we debunk that very often, that because the word was shelling barbed wire machine guns, so I don't know, there was a disproportionate amount of losses from the attackers. Except this is not true, because people reason just in individualistic tactical terms and do not look at the macroscopical evidence in the bigger picture that the losses between attackers and defenders fundamentally equated one another. We've seen it well for Verdun. This was not about gaining this or that piece of land. Admittedly, in mountain warfare, things were more important regarding those specific positions. Also because, again, the defenders could hold with less troops. This is true. But this was about bleeding the enemy wide, exhausting the demographic and industrial capacity of the opponent, and so hoping for his collapse. And so when you look at the picture, the protagonist, the Austro-Hungarian commander-in-chief, the General Franz Konrad von Hötzendorf, understood that, of course, at least envisaged that an invasion, which was also so obviously as macroscopically evident and irreversible, also from the Italian side, that an invasion from Trentino, so we're talking the Central Alps, Central Eastern, like that, consistently talking hundreds of kilometers west of the Isonzo front, was the strategic key to determining the Italian collapse, right? And that would have changed a huge deal, right? Because with a broken Italy, a very large amount of, especially Austro-Hungarian forces, would have been liberated for assisting the Germans on the Western Front. That could have very well turned the tides. Reason for which, of course, Italy was substantially backed by its allies, by France, by Britain. And in this, of course, Hötzendorf was correct. The mountains had historically provided a false or apparent sense of security for defenders, who often neglected their fortifications, and this dates back to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps just to stay in Italy. So while the plateaus where this offensive, as we'll see now, would have been carried out, posed a formidable natural obstacle due to logistical challenges from the side of the offenders, their ballets had a unique, in this context, a strategic value, as they led directly to the Veneto Plains and the prospect of victory. You know that in 1917, the Germans better, like together with the Austro-Hungarians, but the Germans were the decisive element there, broke through the Italian defenses in the east, not in this. In Trentino, we're talking the Battle of Caporetto, right, under the command of the German General Otto von Below. That's interesting if you study the Mata-Jur, that's where Rommel first distinguished himself, which ironically during World War II would become a source of embarrassment, because apparently an Italian officer asked, what kind of decoration is that? So, I want this on the Italian front in 1917. We will see that at some point. We'll talk about Rommel, especially as a man, because we tend sort of, if anything, magnifying the military side of the story for reasons that were essentially made up after World War II. But of course, he was a great commander, but it's mostly like you have to understand to which degree and also what kind of man he was, so just to reconnect with that. We will talk, in fact, today much about Hötzendorf, about Cadorna, because character really in leadership does make an important difference, right? So the concept is easy. If you break through into Italy, into the Po Valley, into Veneto Plains, rather at least in this area, you can basically destroy the greatest part of the Italian industrial capacity. You can knock the country out of the war without even, say, chasing the Italian army across the Apennines. France will have a problem at that point. And so it's, of course, a right intuition, except, of course, there is a disproportionate advantage for the defensive that is the same one that on the zones of front the Austro-Hungarians were enjoying instead. So Hötzendorf hoped, of course, to overcome the initial resistance of the Italian First Army in Trentino through this surprise attack, which naturally was very difficult to achieve because of the scale, right? You're talking hundreds of thousands of people, but he would be very good at least at that. The rest of the Italian forces, so all the various army would have fallen one after another, essentially trapped by this massive flank attack, right, or encirclement from Trentino, the edge, the Adige Valley. But unfortunately for Conrad, the execution of his plans was actually weak, slow, and poorly coordinated, allowing also ample opportunity for a counter-reaction. As we will see also, the actual defensive capacities of the Italians were limited by the same nature of the plateau, right? So things would get more complicated for them as well, and there were command issues from their side. We'll illustrate now. But let's focus a bit on the background, given that it's the first time we discussed this. First of all, Strafexpedition, so punitive expedition in German. This was a term used by the Austro-Hungarian officers for real, right, during secluded discussions about the offensive that General Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf was poised to launch on the Trentino front in the spring of 1916. This information, altered in part by propaganda, reached the Italians through deserters, as we will see now. The colors, the Austro-Hungarians were blue, the Italians were green. They actually were both gray, like gray, blue, gray, green, respectively, in their uniforms. And this also would be obvious, right? You couldn't quite hide or completely hide this major operations, these major offensives. Again, there aren't so many ways to make war, and that's why, in fact, the actual Italian position in the theater was good, was sound, and that's where the surprise element came. Like, nobody would really thought to break through such good position. After all, just like the Italians were also unavoidably trying to break through the Isonzo front on the other side. And so as the storm of war approaches, like, you have these turncoats, these deserters that know, of course, that the assault is about to start, and they do not want to perish into it, so they pass on to the other side, and they reveal this to the Italian side. Now, it's possible that, of course, this Strafexpedition concept was fabricated as a veritable propaganda, as effective propaganda tool by General Luigi Cadorna at the Supreme Command offices in Udine, that are closer to the Isonzo front in the northeast, aimed at steering, because of course it was most important, aimed at steering the indignation of his troops towards the Austro-Hungarian invaders. In fact, there is no evidence to suggest that this derisive term ever appeared in the official records of the imperial army that was actually more sober, right? But there is definitely something about what the Doppelmonarchie thought about Italy that is worth recalling. Whether truth or rumor, a significant eruption was on the rise and driven by this, by the war itself, that was indeed fueled by a fervent anti-Italian sentiment among the Austro-Hungarians that far exceeded mere disdain. For many reasons. Some we already highlighted in the general temper of sort of ethno-nationalistic hostilities and competition. But here, as we also hinted at already, there was something more in the international scene, that is to say, Italy had shamefully betrayed the Triple Alliance, with what was seen by the Habsburgs as this Machiavellian shift in loyalty, so a cowardly act of betrayal that demanded severe retaliation. When one looks at today, we will not talk so much about this, but there is this general notion that Italians changed side or stuff, also for, World War II, etc. This is in part a misrepresentation, especially for World War II, which people are actually more familiar with, but it's actually mostly the other way around. It's just like the Germans that truly didn't admittedly have much trust in the Italians since the beginning, and so acted accordingly. During World War I, of course, it was a more serious aspect. If it hadn't been for the fact that by 1914, objectively, nobody thought that Italy would have seriously entered the war from one side, and it was at least predictable that, of course, that the country had much more at stake being willing to actually betray the alliance that had contracted, decades in advance. In fact, a very different international and strategic situation. Essentially, the Italians had allied themselves with Austria, Hungary, and Germany, actually very much closer to the actual wars that brought to the actual creation of Austria-Hungary. Is essentially a major crack, as you know, in the Habsburgic dominions, when Prussia and Italy had fought against in fact, what was still the Austrian Empire. As you know, the Italians not distinguishing themselves particularly, especially at sea, which is somehow paradoxical, considering the geography of the two countries against the Habsburgic forces. Essentially, Italy had joined the alliance at the time of the French conquest of Tunisia, that Italy had historically considered a sort of Italian thing, like a sort of client state. And they were partially right. It was true also for Libya, that instead was, in fact, later occupied, in the war against the Ottoman Empire. Very interesting war, like also the first one witnessing lots of technological innovations. So aerial bombardment was carried out by Italian Air Force against the Turks and other things. And there was this inherent rivalry between France and Italy, especially at sea, which was sort of more evident. But altogether, at this point, the idea of this bulky Central European and increasingly aggressive, in fact, bloc of Germans, right, that tended to sort of break through, and that especially in the Austro-Hungarian side of the story were aiming at like major and the most sort of obvious direction of expansion, like the heavily industrialized northern Italy that had once belonged, in fact, to the same Habsburgic imperial territories, brought Italy to, of course, to preemptively reason in, first of all, terms of self-defense, but also, as you know, with the secret pacts of London in 1915 for the acquisition of some majority Italian lands in the Adriatic, and also some other possessions that Italy would actually get later on, also in the Eastern Mediterranean, together with the Allies, especially because of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire after the war. But that's also another story we will see another point. Except, of course, before the war was over, nobody could really tell what all these agreements would amount to. Part of the reason why fascism rose is that, Italy had disastrous losses during World War I, and it did not get, essentially as most countries involved, but not getting as much as she had hoped for, which, as you know, was an issue also at Versailles in 1919, etc. But this is all like another story. So what is interesting, speaking of Cadorna, this is also like the other protagonist of this video. The Great War had erupted on July the 31st of 1914. And so at that point, Italy was not at war. But given that Europe was, things were getting ready in a way or another, and by that point, of course, Italy had the plans for, according to the Triple Alliance deal, to attack France, rather. And so General Cadorna himself, so the commander-in-chief of the Italian armed forces, presented a detailed strategic plan for intervention in the war to the King Victor Emmanuel III and the Prime Minister Antonio Salandra. This plan outlined the deployment of 5 army corps to the Rhine front, as the German plan, the master plan, was envisaging. It was something in theory much more complex that should have gone with even, in parallel with the Austro-Hungarian navy to land literally at Antibes, Saint-Tropez, and rising up the Rhone. But it's a very interesting thing. But you will see it in another video. This something that could have never happened realistically, by the way. But that was at least a secondary thought, admittedly. So this was what the Italian military said, given that the Italian chief of staff believed that this was the actual purpose. However, this was the point, that Cadorna himself did not know, speaking of actually, politicians and military speaking, and the general issues like in Italian history to an important degree during both world wars, that the country had not decided for fighting against France, but quite the opposite. And so Cadorna himself remained unaware that Italy was attempting to disentangle itself from the diplomatic web woven over previous decades, which controversially linked it, as we've seen, to the two central powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Think about this, like, you have planned to fight a war in a direction, like as a military man, you have taken your time to evaluate all the geographical features, all the general technicalities of the war, and then you have to start it actually from the opposite side of the Alps. Now, the Triple Alliance had been repeatedly revised. That's what I said. Nobody really, had this strong sense that, that the actual motivations of countries in 1914 could be the ones of decades before, and that's why this master coordination had really undergone severe revision, corresponding to the well-known upheavals, to say the least, going on as unpredictably reshaping the European political landscape. So historic enemies, just to make an example, such as France and Great Britain, had forged bonds. I mean, this was true throughout the 19th century. Of course, things had changed from quite a while. They had, let's say, this was the case also for other opposing political entities. I mean, the same Germany had been born basically giving a massive kick into the nuts to the same Habsburgic Empire, but now they were kind of allies. There was even just from a political point of view, like Republican France and Tsarist Russia, which is not exactly what you would think as a bad couple. But hey, things did have a coherence by the time the war began. And most of it, as we've seen in videos such as the ones about Verdun, about the Freikorps, of course aimed at creating, in that case, the Triple Entente between France, Great Britain, and Russia, to stem a common foe in the very center of Europe that thus also had no other way but to break through, probably in a major continental sense, that is the German Empire. Now, having attained national unity while still relatively weak compared to other European powers, Italy is the last of the big and the first of the little, you can argue. The country pursued its foreign policy with actual boldness, right, engaging in various balancing acts to reinforce its position. The defensive nature of the Triple Alliance, coupled with the opportunity to claim the Italian territories still held by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, prompted Italy to align with the Entente, culminating in the aforementioned secret Treaty of London signed on April the 26th, 1915. Now, much could be said here. I'm not making any specific political, historical, cultural point, but of course, like, this is something we've seen also later from the other side. I mean, there were some Italians that were historically, like, let's say, good Habsburgic subjects, and that still, to an extent, with some peoples in areas that came to be, in fact, conquered by Italy, by the Italian kingdom quite later in time, were not so sure they wanted to side with Italy. There were lots of Italians that wanted to side with Italy. That is also true. But it's like, I don't know, with Yugoslavia during World War II, and parts of Dalmatia were in fact taken over by the communists, and many local Italians, as you know, were obliged to leave. There were many Slavs that said, we are actually Italians, because they thought that their civic identity was with the Italian state, regardless of being Slavic. And so, actually, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is probably the most effective example of this plurinationality, where, of course, things were basically derailing, degenerating. I mean, the crisis of 1867 is, in many ways, the same by which Austria-Hungary was at this point essentially following Germany in her destiny, because of the otherwise scarce survivability of the system alone, at least, with all the ethno-nationalistic tensions existing at that point. That's why, for example, the Hungarian element was not a particularly cooperative one. Consequently, and that's why I was talking about the age of nationalism, the same Germans, the same Austrians, to say better, as Germans, were ever more sensitive to the pan-Germanistic ideologies and rhetoric. And this is the spread of the Fourth Estate, the fact that, of course, the Habsburgic monarchy was not particularly healthy at this point anymore. And so that sense of, again, there was a Holy Roman Empire in which you could have Germans, Italians, Czechs, etc., that had really been one of the greatest and highest manifestation of European tradition, was no more, because it was being cannibalized by the same ethno-nationalism. Now, just 4 weeks after the London Treaty, Italy would declare war on Austria-Hungary. Only to Austria-Hungary. The Italians did not declare war on Germany, and actually Germany was almost thankful for that, in spite of the fact that now, of course, this was a hostile nation against them, but they were interested themselves in not having Italy posturing herself, like declaring war to Germany as well. And this, of course, can't seem, from the Italian side, a Machiavellian decision, though it is ultimately justified. I mean, also so seeking to address the internal political issues steered by, in this case, the same Italian irredentists and interventionists, including prominent figures like D'Annunzio and Mussolini at the time, for example. Hence, you can understand, in this case, as we also pointed out for the rest of the war, against those attitudes like, no, but the common people just did not want war. They actually didn't hate one another. They were just peaceful. No, everybody hated each other's guts in a disproportionately aggressive and bloodthirsty way. And this was true for the Italians and the Austrians. Also, generally speaking, say the Magyars, the Czechs, etc., like, followed the trail of, say, Habsburgic direction, regardless of their national issues. Yes, there were some deserters, like to same, that passed over to the same Italians in that case, but or the Russians. But that happens in every circumstance. As we pointed out, Cadorna was kept unaware of these political maneuvers that weren't his job, and so he adapted accordingly as a military man his plans without raising too many questions. Cadorna has an interesting personality, just like Hötzendorf, that they are different. This will play, as we pointed out, a very important role in the offensive. Now, in the meanwhile, Cadorna grappled with providing vague but convincing replies to inquiries from his now allied, like German and Austrian counterparts. This is before the war broke out, as these actors were eager to know how many Italian troops they could count on, still thinking that the country would go at war with and not against them. Right? Just think about the awkwardness. The Austrian public opinion, as we just pointed out, had bought into that pan-Germanistic and consequently anti-Italianistic feeling that, again, did not exist basically in Europe in a historical, traditional way until basically the century before. We can descend into the broader cultural and anthropological issues. Of course, there was a lot of racism. It was thought, the Italians were an inferior race, that historically, the imperial power had been somehow dislodged from the peninsula by a sort of concerted array of alliances, like the Great French Commitment, the war against Germany, and so that the Italians had basically escaped like the full might of Austrian power, and so that now somebody had to teach them a lesson. This situation was actually much more balanced, of course, and events like the one of 1916 would prove it. Now, it mattered little that the treaty, like the Triple Alliance, had been revised and amended through diplomatic efforts over the years to the point of losing its original significance even, or that even Conrad himself once sought authorization to attack Italy in 1911 when it entered the conflict against the Ottoman Empire, right? This is an interesting thing. For example, in 1908, there was the famous earthquake of Messina that caused a major tsunami that destroyed, in fact, an important part of Straits area, and the Italian military was sent by the kingdom to assist the local population, etc. At that point, the Austro-Hungarian military proposed Franz Joseph, the Kaiser, let's attack the Italians now because their forces are so absorbed by this disaster. And Franz Joseph, that incarnated that Habsburg-Lorraine sense of nobility and chivalry, said, "Are you crazy? Like it's such a dishonorable thing to do." And then just for saying how much actual hatred existed also towards the Italians, but how much of this also stemmed from a time in history that we tend to deeply misunderstand in many ways and to forget a bit too quickly, even though something is still there beneath the surface if you scratch a little. And that I think episodes like histories like today's, I think are quite interesting as a starting point to discuss it, to understand better. Franz Conrad von Oetzendorf had conceived the idea of a preemptive strike against Italy from Trentino during his command of the infantry division stationed in Tyrol from 1903 to 1906. An avid mountaineer, Oetzendorf had traversed the mountains in preparation to convert them into a battlefield. Very important life experience and practice for knowing the terrain. Although the audacious proposal cost him temporarily the position of Chief of Staff of the Imperial Army in 1911 due to its political inappropriateness, with Emperor Franz Joseph having reinstated him in the Supreme Command with war now underway, his plans could finally be realized. Right, breaching the Italian line on the Asiago Plateau and advancing into the Veneto Plain at Vicenza could encircle the hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers who were already pressuring the Austrians on the Isonzo and in the Dolomites. A decisive victory over the Italian First Army would lead to the capture of the Second, the Third, the Fourth, forcing Italy into submission. For Austria, already strained by multiple fronts and particularly anxious about the situation in Galicia against the Russians, the prospect of eliminating the Italian threat ignited hope of avoiding annihilation in the ongoing war. So this is quite interesting because, of course, there is all Austro-Hungarian background to the war that had to juggle with different fronts, with 3 fronts at a time. By the way, the Italians were also active in the Balkans. There was like a general equilibrism from the Austro-Hungarian side in terms of not much the amount of resources available, but just the general issues, again, of this multinational empire. All right. And there were very interesting things, like normally you would send, I don't know, Ukrainians on the Italian front and, I don't know, Czechs on the Serbian, except those were Slavs, for example. Like, so they would try to dilute a bit like the general sentiments of the, say, peoples that lived at the frontier with their enemies, sort of to make them blend generally a bit more about the overall cause. It's very different, but say the Italians after the unification had used the military the military levy in similar patterns of distribution. Say people from Sicily were stationed to Piedmont just to foster the sense of nationhood that, at least in a unitary political sense, Italy had not had for centuries. So these are very particular. Look, we're habituated mostly to the sort of, we see it from the Middle Ages, like the countries like France and you can say England because that would have evolved into Britain, let's say, but let's say that are much more neatly outlined sort of national states, right? Some states are either, again, very nationally composed, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or had actually a pretty old nationality, like the Italian one, in spite of the fact that the Austrians were trying to deny that that was other than just a geographical expression, but had not had, in fact, a stable state from actually a unitary state. And so this would make them sort of weaker, still, say, in a quite developing situation. Now, Oetzendorf's plan. So, geography provided the Austro-Hungarians with a significant strategic opportunity. Capitalizing on it proved to be a much more complex challenge, because the Asiago Plateau, also known as the Seven Communes one, presented itself as an extremely hostile battlefield. Right, we will see not just for the Austro-Hungarians, but the burden of the offensive naturally is greater. So this is a quadrangular massif flanked by steep cliffs, the stretch between the Brent and the Astico rivers, measuring 25 kilometers wide from east to west and 30 kilometers deep from north to south. Right, so pretty small distances, but of course the efforts are dramatically amplified, right, in mountain warfare. On the north, you have 20 peaks exceeding 2,000 meters in height that create a first plateau, let's say, and then traversing the area leads into a jagged central basin that is the second plateau instead, with an average elevation of 1,000 meters. And this area is one of the coldest in the Alps, with winter temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius and an average snowfall reaching 2 meters, while water, this is incredibly important for this battlefield, is scarce. Due to the karst nature of the soil, that is something you find also in the Eastern Alps, like also in the other parts where the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians were fighting, which absorbs moisture. There are these, essentially water goes underground and reemerges in other places, but on the surface you don't really have much of it. It's not held, right? So you can't quite get it, which is terrifying. Despite these harsh conditions, Franz Conrad von Oetzendorf was convinced that he could surmount the challenges. In fact, it's important to open a parenthesis on the shared Italian and Austrian, especially specifically pride regarding their Alpine capacities, because there had been not just, of course, a development of the respective armed forces in function of Alpine warfare, but there had also been a big deal of this in the previous eras. Notionistically, think about the Tyrolean Andreas Hofer in the Napoleonic era, or Giuseppe Garibaldi's Chasseur of the Alps, right, during the wars of Italian unification. So there is a unique nature of mountain warfare that also does not allow for much doctrinal innovation. Like the military manuals used by these armies were dating to take the 18th century in the essence, right, of what mountain warfare really is. We have seen it also in the Kampfkriege by von Clausewitz that talked about this is really relevant even for a Prussian that doesn't have at least too many mountains to overcome. Now, so the unique nature of warfare in mountainous regions has long suggested the effectiveness of utilizing units composed of soldiers from local populations familiar with such terrain. And these soldiers, accustomed to high altitudes, cold climates, and physical demands, did not require, for example, the acclimatization and rigorous training that was necessary for those coming from lowland areas. And this is important because, say, like Italy is actually pretty mountainous throughout. In fact, many Alpine troops actually came from central Italy, from the Abruzzi Massifs, for example. But for Austria, does not really have mountains. The Tyrol has, like other, say, parts of what is effectively like, say, other than Austria narrowly meant, like what would be Niederösterreich today in historical perspective, because I reason with a medieval mindset. By the way, I made a video about medieval Tyrol. If you're interested in the same localities where this battle was fought, check those out, because we have seen there, like valley by valley, also the difference, because most of these were essentially German speaking areas, but of course there is the Italian name. It also comes for Südtirol, that, as you know, is today part of the Italian Republic, as a consequence, by the way, of World War the First. This is extremely relevant because, as you know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was parceled out, and the Italians specifically also got the Brenner Pass, so it's a very important change. History would be relevant later had, for example, Germany and Italy had gone at war in the 30s, which was actually a thing, potentially, but we'll talk about that in another occasion. And so Alpine troops had always been an important element of this country's tradition. This naturally led to the development of units with strong ethnic and regional ties as a consequence, fostering camaraderie and morale that often needed to be painstakingly cultivated in other military contexts instead. The mountain unites in that sense. If you're born and raised in those valleys and you have been training, not just as a military man, you know them, that's important. It has all an impact. In fact, some of the finest Alpine troops were recruited from the areas where, in fact, most of the war would be fought, in this case. Now, Italy, with its abundant mountainous landscapes, particularly between the Alps and the Apennines, has a rich tradition of specialized mountain warfare units, most notably the Alpini. Established in 1872, just after the country's unification and the war with Austria, the Alpini were created in response to Italy's concern, not just now at that point, like Austria was knocked out. They were mostly created, as we've seen also in part with the alliance that was signed with Austria and Germany shortly afterwards, about a potential attack from France following the Italian annexation of the Papal States and Rome in the previous years. Now, the need for effective defense along the Alpine borders highlighted the necessity for specialized forces. In 1873, the Alpini, adopted their distinctive black feather, black for the regular troops and adorned with an eagle for the officers. This is incredibly interesting as far as our history of warfare revolving around the traditional war bands, because it actually equates to, again, the eagle of leadership, the transfigured eagle, and then the chthonic, darker followers, like in that say initiatory subordinate that they mention, right? There is a powerful symbolism there. And France responded in 1889 by forming the Chasseurs Alpins, who are easily recognizable by their unique headgear that is a white beret known for its shape as the tarte, which translates to cake in French. The Austro-Hungarians, of course, also have a storied tradition of mountain troops, beginning with the Tyroleans, who distinguished, as we were recalling before, themselves in battles against Napoleon in 1809, in incredibly effective guerrilla forces. And remember that Tyroleans are not Austrians. That's actually, maybe just calling them Italians would trigger the most, but Tyroleans are Tyroleans, and that's very much that part of Central European sort of provincialism that characterizes these lands. However, it wasn't until, in fact, the 20th century that the Austro-Hungarians formally organized the unit of the Gebirgsjäger, parallel to the Italian Alpini, under the same General Conrad von Hotzendorf's initiative. And their symbol is the Edelweiss flower. This is interesting because I've seen the guy had also very well known those mountainous areas, and so doctrinally speaking, these forces are even reflective of such experience. Mountain troops are not, of course, exclusive to Europe. Just to make an example, the famous Gurkhas from Nepal that are, quite fierce and famous in general, but they originate exactly from one of the highest regions in the world and are renowned as some of the finest soldiers in this specialized field. As early as late 1915, Hötzendorf had presented his plans concerning the Tyrolean offensive against Italy to his German counterpart Erich von Falkenhayn, whose profile we have outlined also from a doctrinal and characteral point of view in the video about the Battle of Verdun. So what is interesting about these commanders-in-chief is that they are somehow similar regarding the general attitude to warfare, the doctrinal insights that were actually competent, right? We will see now how, Falkenhayn was pretty good. Again, it was substituted after Verdun, but it's not like the Germans really improved. The same was the case for Cadorna. It was removed later on, was substituted by Diaz, but it was still the best and actually very competent Italian commander at the time that in many ways was sort of the only one to actually succeed in developing the Italian military during the war for the same war in the way it did. And the reason why Hötzendorf was presenting, of course, this plan to Falkenhayn was not the fact that, of course, that allies shared during joined forth such ideas and sort of exchanged orders and opinions and so on, but of course, because of what we said before, the general Austro-Hungarian subordination to Germany, and that in this case brought Hötzendorf to hope to secure the necessary German support of up to 9 frontline German divisions, along with their heavy artillery for the Italian front. So we're talking about a grand total for the offensive of 25 divisions, or at least 20, which is a lot, as you understand. Let's talk about von Hötzendorf first a little, because he had, as we've seen, held the position of chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff starting in 1906. So, like many officers of his era, this is really important, he lacked significant battlefield experience. Nonetheless, he was a prolific scholar of modern warfare and appeared to be the right choice to oversee a military apparatus that had changed little since the time of Marshal Radetzky, attracting the attention of the same Kaiser Franz Joseph. However, Oetzendorf was missing a crucial attribute for such a role, which actually places him in a sort of worse rank compared to these other, commanders-in-chief. That is to say, political acumen, right? He first of all had a sort of difficult personality. This was important for perhaps the surprise effect. It was a very sort of Plutonian, introverted individual, but he was also provided this pinch of stinging capacity, and so this brought him to lack completely diplomatic skills. He was even an overly enthusiastic. He was a very sort of humoral, even emotional person, even if it didn't show it on the surface, but that was his kind of nature and character. He was a staunch advocate for a large-scale global war of some sort. He promoted this idea with unwavering enthusiasm, right? And in great part, and that's why that introduction was important, he had a veritable disdain towards Italy and Serbia, not just these, but mostly as these Austrian enemies, viewing, for all the historical reasons we pointed out before, that their very existence as nations as absurd and a challenge to the Austro-Hungarian crown. Right? Consider that the Italians had saved the entire Serbian army, shipping it across the Adriatic. It was one of the major feats in the history of military engineering, just like the internal communication, like everything was made by the Italian genius. You will have to cover that thing. And as you know, Serbia at a point resists, but is also knocked out of the war. And now Italy was the main objective. Yes, there were the Tsarists out there, but the Germans were basically handling most of the situation for the Austro-Hungarians. And this is, in fact, also another criticism towards Oetzendorf, that he hadn't really accomplished much up to that point, nor he would, in fact, not even on this occasion. It's fair to say that as a strategist, he demonstrated a certain intuition and commendable organizational skills, earning him considerable acclaim domestically and recognition from military historians alike. However, it is equally clear that he did not achieve any notable victories. The most important accomplishment, indeed, is the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive in 1915, but there he heavily relied on German support. Once again, it would be interesting really to talk about how Austria-Hungary went to war, in also considering its sort of initial role, the sort of the major involvement, of course, in the decision making. But speaking of Oetzendorf specifically, the Strafexpedition would be his most glaring shortcoming, right? Because there he lacked really realism. He was unable to align resources with objectives, which especially in mountain warfare is a big deal. So if you're a good strategist, you don't have just to be able to identify opportunities, but also the insight to determine how and with what forces these opportunities can be effectively exploited. Right? There's a general sense, a coup d'oeil, general intuition and broader intelligence and experience should point to the actual concreteness of the hopes of success, at least. And as we will see now, the Germans did not like this idea of the offensive, the Trentino offensive of 1916, right? For which Oetzendorf that carried it out nevertheless, because the command had already decided this, overlooked logistical considerations. which also in mountain warfare is a huge deal, he basically placed undue faith in his ability to resolve problems as they arose, and more critically delegating this responsibility to his subordinates. And so, following the Battle of the Altipiani, Hötzendorf's career and reputation as a strategist began to rapidly decline, ultimately making the German proposal for the unified command of the German and the Austro-Hungarian forces really achieved. Like this was led really by the Germans that by 1917 were, really taking control of the whole situation. And so for Hötzendorf, this resulted in a dismissal and a permanent exit from public life because he was disgraced. And this happened again all to these other figures, to an extent at least, with von Falkenhayn, with Cadorna, except in the case of Hötzendorf, that was actually because of an actual shortcoming. I mean, von Falkenhayn at Verdun did actually nail it, right? And so there was more like a specifically political and ideological reason why that offensive, by not ultimately managing to break through, was seen as intolerable in order to maintain this guy in command. But it was also like, first of all, he was the only one capable of trying that, and it wasn't even technically just a failure per se, because of what we said before about the scale of losses and etc. The same goes for Cadorna in general, right? Regarding the shortcomings of the Italian army, that the entire system under him did work after all, right? And he was definitely the best commander that Italy had at the time. Now, when Hötzendorf, just to make a step back, of course, this was a sort of mega spoiler, but you know how things went. This is not really the major spoiler. Spoiler is what happened during the offensive. When Hötzendorf presented his plan to Falkenhayn, the latter voiced serious reservations about such an extensive offensive in mountainous terrain. As we've seen, like, at least for what also the German troops would have been involved, like this was a major operation. As we've seen, sort of a small, like just some hundred of square kilometers, wasn't in the mountains. So it seriously was a very concerning situation. And Falkenhayn was right. He argued that the unpredictable nature of mountain warfare could diminish the likelihood of success, which is exactly what would happen. The logistical demands to sustain operations involving such a large force could not withstand the inherent pressures posed by the enemy and the land. For example, a landslide itself, equipment failure, or swollen rivers could halt the advance, leading to disastrous consequences. There is a specific momentum. Things do not happen just because of numbers, but because of moral forces. And so, especially the offensive, it does have, as von Clausewitz says, the positive aim, but it's also the weak form of war. Conversely, the Italians were being passive because, in part, of the same considerations that von Falkenhayn had envisaged, that they enjoyed an important advantage provided by defense, especially in that terrain, even though they hadn't probably thought out how an actual battle there would actually look like. There was, however, more importantly, a political barrier between Hötzendorf and Falkenhayn. That is to say, Germany, as we said before, was not at war with Italy. This is very important, and Germany did not want to be at war with Italy. We will explain why in better later, some other time on Schwerpunkt. So had Germany sent divisions on the Italian front, this would have brought to the war with the Kingdom of Israel. And so such attack would disrupt the comfortable status of mutual indifference, because otherwise they would have really had to, say, bother one another, and in that case, from a German perspective, yielding no advantage for the Reich. Furthermore, there was another consideration directly affecting the German strategic priorities, which is, obviously, Verdun. Right. Von Falkenhayn could not send German reinforcements, especially in that number, in the face of this massive offensive being prepared at Verdun, with all the specific aim of bleeding France into submission. And of course, France was more important to knock out of the war than Italy. Preparations for that operation, set to commence on February 21st, were already underway, leaving the German commander unable to spare even one division, much less 9 or more, for a secondary front like Italy, especially for an endeavor he believed was doomed to fail anyway. Because again, had it succeeded, like, it would have not been bad for the Germans either. It's rather, how much you would bet this specific operation to succeed, which is a completely different issue, and one of high strategic competence. Thus, von Falkenhayn advised von Hötzendorf to remain on the defensive on the Alps. Right, he had strong positions overlooking the massives. So this actually created an issue between them, as they already did not really get along particularly well. It's not like really that they didn't like each other very much, but von Falkenhayn was somehow much more practical, much colder, right? He was much more like Cadorna in many ways, and in fact that would prove to be important in the same battle of the Altipiani. But the Austro-Hungarians had already decided for the so-called Strafexpedition. And so even though they may have refrained from using this specific term, as we've seen their animosity towards Italy, coupled with a disdain for the fighting spirit of its troops, like all the, again, socially and ethnically Darwinistic prejudices, again, the Italians are a lesser race, that they came later, that they're not as powerful as us, etc., did carry considerable weight in this Austrian overconfidence, which would have been retributed in kind, right? In fact, yes, Hötzendorf's confidence in his forces may have been excessive. On the other hand, it wasn't also entirely baseless. As we'll see now, this major battle would be quite hardly fought. And so highlighting what both the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians were actually made of, right, in one or another. Despite Hötzendorf's lack of combat experience before 1914, he was rightly recognized as the leading theorist and strategist of Emperor Franz Josef's army. Arguably one of the finest of his era within that context. So his approach was a calculated risk. The Austro-Hungarian troops, this is very important, had endured 5 Italian offensives already on the Isonzo front with minimal retreats, not minimal losses. Actually, they had taken their beating, but they had, of course, contained the Italians every time. So this had bolstered their morale and confidence. They said, these Italians can't break through. We are the better ones. We can't wait, in fact, as every defender to pass to the counteroffensive to get it over with. Now, in Galicia and Serbia, the other Austro-Hungarian fronts, the situation had fundamentally stabilized. The crises of the previous months seemed behind them, and as a result, it was feasible to withdraw troops from these fronts for an offensive, replacing them with second-line units or simply reducing their numbers. Because for Austria-Hungary at this point, breaking Italy would have really solved enormous issues. Like with Russia, you could hope to situation was not favorable. But say you break through Russia, you have, as the Germans would do, I would have to chase them into like the depths of the country with increasing logistical difficulties. And yes, as you know, Russia was knocked out of the war, nevertheless, because of internal upheavals, but because the fact that its forces collapsed. Serbia was not, of course, that relevant as either of the former enemies. So regardless, of course, of the Allied presence in the Balkans, which was yet another issue, but again, the Italian front seemed the most promising at this point, especially considering this general surprise effect could be achieved. I mean, the Italians, as we've seen, had concentrated so much into the onset, so the Austro-Hungarians had also concentrated elsewhere and just held their defensive position. The Italians now attacking them in Trentino seemed like novelty, to the point of hoping to achieve some degree of success at least. This maneuver allowed for the concentration of 14 divisions in South Tyrol. This formed two armies, totaling nearly 160,000 men, with essentially an additional 200,000 assigned to the reserve, to rear services, let's say, accompanied by a vast artillery arsenal capable of dismantling any resistance. There was a little also German help from a technological point of view. Austria-Hungary was actually the least technological power in Italy, Russia were actually pioneering more military capacities in many ways, on air, at sea, etc. And even in just land forces. Austria-Hungary came with that sort of very, again, traditional, continental, Middle European sense of that. Again, just Austria was basically the most advanced country. The others were very somehow poor agricultural countries. They were a competent power, but in many ways their resources were limited, especially as far as technology was concerned. This is what, thanks also to the German help that had provided with some insight on the development of howitzers, especially. Oetzendorf had a significant advantage in artillery. On the Carso front, he had experimented successfully with using tractors to transport heavy artillery. The Italians were still relying on ox-drawn carts, which is also only a part, as we're illustrating, of how, in this sense, they were behind the Austro-Hungarians, but also for reasons that have to do with the way the German-Italian communications in that part of the country were just being developed through the war. Right, many railway stations, for example, were created in northern Italy, in the northeastern part, just by the actual army in those years of World War I. So boosting actually further, as later, the industrialization of the country. Now, these mechanical means enabled the Austro-Hungarian transport of 8 enormous 30.5 centimeters mortars and 3 even more formidable 420 millimeters howitzers. This was the Austro-Hungarian equivalent to the Dicke Bertha that we have seen for the German imperial forces at the battle of Verdun, to achieve that sort of sophisticated hammering, essentially almost carpet bombing capacity, that in fact the Germans were falconized. We were really replacing most of the hopes, let's say, into as a tip of the balance. And so the Austro-Hungarians were sort of from that part of the story as well. To the Tyrolean front, so we're looking at weapons weighing 21 and 105 tons respectively, capable of firing. However, this was the aspect shells weighing 400 and 1,000 kilos, which is insane. sufficient in fact to reduce an enemy fortification to rubble. In total, nearly 2,000 guns were assembled. This is just like a fraction of the several times more you see in Verdun, for example. But it's still a lot, considering the mountain environment and the relatively small... Well, okay, also at Verdun, the actual surface was pretty small, but overall, like in the hellish Asiago Highlands landscape. Now, of these 2,000 guns, by the way, only 1/4 were heavy, right? But the point was to unleash, of course, on the Italians, their first experience of carpet bombardment, so the simultaneous fire over a wide area that trapped enemy forces in an inescapable zone of destruction. This is important because Verdun had, before the offensive started, had already happened, and as you know, it's only in the first days that fire concentration turned out to be useful. But doctrine had not yet adequate, and so here it was the Austro-Hungarian experiment from their side on the Italian front, the German equivalent on the French. So it's worth digressing briefly on this, because when we think about carpet bombing, conventionally we often think as a starter of World War II, right? Particularly at that point, the high altitude bombers unleashing their devastating payloads over major cities in Europe and beyond. However, its roots can really be traced back to World War I, regardless of the means employed, right? Mostly terrestrial. So by the end of the 19th century, the second industrial revolution had brought to major advancements in metallurgy and explosives, which led to the development of artillery pieces that, as we've seen, had unmatched power and range. Crucial to this were the industrial capabilities and that, of course, nations were differently provided with to keep themselves with highly effective weapons, but there was little understanding of how to deploy them efficiently. World War I had been fundamentally misunderstood in its anticipation. Then actually the military doctrine of all armies adapted quite sophisticatedly effective way since the beginning of, say, the first months of war. Before the beginning of the war, however, the prevailing military doctrine prioritized direct fire, which of course characterized also the early stages of the Great War, if anything, because there weren't also other type of guns in, say, the same availability of these direct fire ones, which is an important issue, as artillery batteries were, of course, positioned along the front lines, and initially just on them, literally, so not in the rear, as it would grow even during the course of the war, especially like during the prevalent, say, positional one of the West. So the sense initially was these direct fire guns to easily target enemy positions and closely support infantry operations as well, because you just would essentially see where troops were going and you would sort of channel this fire. However, this positioning in the front line left them vulnerable to enemy counter-battery fire as well as to the same machine guns and rifles, telling the truth, because the heavy frontal shields often has actually failed to adequately protect the crews, resulting in the silencing of the same guns, which could not be afforded evenly. So the most straightforward doctrinal solution was to reposition the artillery away from the front lines, perhaps hiding it behind a ridge, thus allowing for the use of their extended range to what became known, however, now also in a ballistic and consequently technical sense and need, as indirect fire. And that's what howitzers and mortars are best for, thus regaining prominence also in the industrial production and military availability. Despite being shorter range and having a curved trajectory compared to cannons, obviously these weapons fired projectiles of massive caliber, as we've seen, exemplified by the aforementioned Austro-Hungarian 30.5 centimeters mortars and 42 centimeters howitzers used during the Battle of the Plateaus, 1916. Now, artillery of various calibers was deployed in a systematic manner with limited observation over the target area, relying on the sheer number of guns. It was a saturating strategy, right? Just the weight of the projectiles, the length of the bombardment was enough to literally carpet bomb the air, and so basically destroying almost everything. Even though, as we've seen also from Verdun, it was not enough to simply eradicate any presence, and actually would mess up the quite mathematically calculated plans about where and how troops had to advance into also a land that was completely disfigured and irregular, also as far as the defensive position that the survivors would take were concerned. You can imagine if that was an issue in Verdun, how this would be a major issue, aside from even just the logistical ones, in the Alps, right? So, of course, also indirect fire sacrificed the element of surprise to a degree, at least as far as the protracted bombing was concerned, because otherwise we would have to deploy the guns in the first lines. We've seen this would have not just silenced them, but also not been a surprise for long. And so the idea was supporting infantry, like paving the way to them, and there is this motto that encapsulates the general idea of it, that is to say, artillery conquers, infantry occupies, which is not far from the truth. Now, the Austro-Hungarians employed this crude, yet relatively effective tactic, not just during the initial phases of battles, but throughout their course, managing to amass sufficient firepower. For instance, the bombardment on May the 18th, we will see now against Asiago itself, that reduced the city to a pile of rubble. But let's pass to at least the preparations for the offensive, and so what the Italians were understanding from their side about it in advance. The Austro-Hungarian preparations began in February 1916, which turned, by the way, to roll into a bustling hub of soldiers eager for action. The task was monumental in a strategical and logistical sense. You can just imagine carrying those artillery pieces up mount. Like, it was really an enormous deal, with very improvised means as well. Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf proved, however, to be at least an excellent organizer. This is really a very good quality of his, despite the severe cold of that winter, in February again in the Alps, and snow drifts reaching 2 to 4 meters. Preparations proceeded with vigor and determination, maintaining high morale among the Austro-Hungarian troops, evidently showing that the general commitment against the Italians was, pretty high. In fact, not even the logistical challenges that seemed to be more cyclopic deter the Austro-Hungarians. However, the mountains were, as they always are, ever unforgiving. And so what happened in the following spring, March and April, witnessed the bringing of additional snow, right, along with the inevitable avalanches and landslides that impeded the movements of men and supplies for days. Consequently, the launch of the offensive had to be postponed week after week until as late as mid-May, when things had not even improved that much in terms of weather conditions. Now, a military operation of such magnitude could hardly remain hidden, obviously. And it's actually quite surprising by how much the Austro-Hungarians managed to keep it so. Delays and challenges, of course, did not help. And this Tyrolean build-up could hardly be a complete secret. As early as February, in fact, the Italians began receiving unmistakable indications of unusual enemy activity. But this was not enough to convince them that the enemy was actually as seriously opting for such Alpine offensive. Deserters were important because these soldiers were telling the Italians that Özendorf was preparing this major offensive, but there was also there were some times like deserters sent properly to spread fake news to confuse the enemies. On top of this, Özendorf was also attempting to march his troops along concealed paths to evade the Italian vantage points that in the mountains were indeed strong. Now, this was done only when it was feasible, because you don't even have too many paths up there available for such operations. And in fact, this actually brought to interruptions along this newly found Austro-Hungarian routes, forcing the troops for deviations, bringing columns and the fumes of motor vehicles into the line of sight, also lookout posts manned by the Italians that were gathering, of course, some interesting information from this all. Now, while the element of surprise was compromised, it was not entirely lost. Cadorna understood the intricacies of mounted warfare, right? He was competent in that and could scarcely believe what the Austro-Hungarians were doing. Like, it seemed really impossible for them to be executing something that, in fact, the same Germans that said, this is not going to work, don't do it, right? Obviously, from both sides, there were general considerations about all the theaters across the front, and, things were considered with that higher or lesser credibility, considering the practicality of warfare. Thus, this is actually the largest mountain battle of this war, and indeed the largest in all of history, like in the mountains. This is incredibly important. And definitely, as this video proves, it happened, right? And it was about to happen the time the Italians were interrogating themselves about what the hell was going on. The entire thing was primarily fought in rugged terrain. Nevertheless, to Cadorna and the Italian military command, the Austro-Hungarians were merely conducting a limited offensive intended to distract them from the Isonzo front, right? Because there, Italian preparations were underway for a sixth significant offensive against Gorizia, Görlitz. So everything was a major bet from both sides, like depending on the availability of troops on the relative parts of the front. An anomaly was apparent in the intelligence reports reaching the Italian command, because while numerous alarming signals were coming from the front, the Italian spies in Vienna reported nothing of significance. This discrepancy led to the formation of two parallel channels of information that should have converged at the Supreme Command for analysis and comparison. However, in the offices of Udine, there was a greater reliance on confidential sources, so things like personal accounts, whispers within the halls of the Habsburgic court, and so the Italians relied more on the general intelligence, and so they thought that if something big was being planned, they would have been able to gather information from the same Aufburg, from the same Schönbrunn. That was not quite the case. And so nobody really brought this up in a, say, to back, let's say, the military suspicions that were mounting up on the front, right? Which is interesting because it tells you also how good the Austro-Hungarians were at concealing this. You should be worried when there is too much silence, as a matter of fact. This is true in every political and strategic situation. In fact, however, the Italian disbelief regarding this potential Austro-Hungarian offensive was really shared also by her allies, right? The French, the British did not believe that the Austrians were likely attempting an assault on the Trentino front. And how would especially the Austro-Hungarians source the necessary troops? Right? There was still the sense that the Galician front against the Russians was sort of critical for the Habsburgs, and so that they would not divert troops from there, potentially inviting disaster otherwise. However, at the same time, they did see that there were less troops there, and so the question is, what are they doing, right? Do they want just to, to distract the Italians? Because maybe, again, they are trying to offend yet again on the Isonzo. There was something strange. Basically, the Allies understood there was a gamble going on. And the general disbelief prevailed in spite of it. Prudence is never unwarranted. Cadorna, anticipating the sixth battle on the Isonzo, wanted to minimize distractions behind them because of the necessary need of focus for this major, again, bloodbath that required a broader commitment and a unity of intent. That's what, in fact, the Austro-Hungarians were sort of playing on to an extent with their intelligence. On March the 22nd, Cadorna issued orders to General Roberto Brusati, commander of the First Army in Trentino, to relinquish the territory gained so far on that front and withdraw to what were defined like the main defensive positions of the Italians, thus adopting a purely defensive strategy. So Cadorna basically decided, okay, there is something strange going on. Let's be cautious enough and let's at least make our positions withdraw, in the case there is any kind of offensive, because they thought at least there would be something there. They had understood that, but they did not understand the size of it. So at least they poised themselves in a defensive posture that would, in part, in fact, help them. It was a sensible decision. So, regarding further, hints that this could have been, in fact, bigger than simply a distracting operation, engaging Cadorna in discussion proved challenging, right? We will understand his kind of mentality now, because he was not a leader particularly open to differing opinions. Which, in part, it was a double-edged sword in many ways, because it was exactly that inflexibility that, yes, caused part of the damage, but also was able to remedy to that. This was typical of the Italian doctrinal mindset, because consider that these were, Italy, as you know, had been unified under a Piedmontese effort, and the Piedmontese were basically the single most militaristic state. It was kind of the Prussia of Italy. It had really a very rigid, again, background in military history that mostly revolved just given the geographical situation around the defense of the Alps, which meant that actually they were pretty well sort of experienced, because this Piedmontese doctrine was infused eventually into the Italian army, which inherited a very rigid mindset in turn, right, regarding mostly the idea that, okay, we have mountains, we just stand this ground, and whoever arrives, we pour the hell on them, and we push them back. And actually, this had worked for Savoy historically. There are some very interesting, there's the Battle of Viaset, there is a very interesting strategic approach that, however, was not the best one for more movement warfare. Why did Prussia, for example, at some point in the 19th century develops the type of doctrine it does? It's not just, of course, because of the genius of von Clausewitz's legacy and great figures like Moltke, It's of course also the political mandate, Bismarck, etc. But it's because also it's Central Europe, right? It's an open ground. It's largely a flat one, so a lot of movement must happen. Understandably, Italy had to maintain also with its neighbors that are on land just, in fact, across the Alps, that kind of mountain warfare mindset, which had resulted in some great inflexibility, like an incredible emphasis on discipline, to the point of, even cruelty to an extent, but that was actually, and especially for this type of war, much more effective than we think, right? And Cadorna was actually the product of that mindset. Thus, Brusati in this case, that had, of course, there were many Italian officers that had understood, of course, the opportunities coming from sort of more maneuvering warfare in spite of the limitations of the particular theaters where they operated. And they had envisaged the possibility, in fact, that the Austro-Hungarians may be doing, as strange as it would seem on a strategic standpoint. It's something that, however, did not have to be excessively underestimated either. Brusati doubted he could persuade the Generalissimo, and so he was actually right. There was also an issue, in fact, with the general dispositions that Cadorna had adopted, because the Italian First Army had at some point advanced to a degree that would actually reduce the front stretch by even like a lot, like 2/5 of the wall, given the nature of the Alps there. And this did favor for a defensive setup. For, of course, you would be able to narrow the front, deepen the lines. The problem, though, is that the front was constricted against mountains themselves, dominated by the Austrians. So the Italians lacked in any way the necessary space for effective defense. Brusati anticipated the imminent Strafexpedition, but he chose to interpret the orders they had received by Cadorna and maintain the First Army in its current position, primarily in the front line. So actually with this position that was more aggressive than anything, at least prepared to counterattack if necessary. While seeking to establish stronger defensive positions on the mountains ahead. To this end, he persistently requested additional troops, because it's as if you had all these troops, say, on forward without, on better places for defense, but not actually enough space for remaining up there, especially against a massive onslaught like the Austro-Hungarian one. So he kept requesting and receiving troops. Cadorna brought them to rise to approximately 110,000 soldiers. Some strongholds had been fortified behind the lines for added security. So at least if the first lines break, of course you have something to fall back on, but it wasn't as easy to on this terrain to actually create something more stable. In fact, the continuous and organized second and third defensive lines, typical of a robust defense in depth, had not yet materialized. And so if a withdrawal became necessary, significant improvisation would be required. That was mostly on the initiative of the various units, with unpredictable outcomes. It was just not the ideal. So in early May, Cadorna visited the front. Isolated artillery shells, some of considerable power for the aforementioned Austro-Hungarian monster guns, let's say, had been landing on the Italian line for days, right? And these were yet another indicator of an incipient offensive, right? Because these were adjustment shots signaling the impeding bombardment for an attack, further corroborating previous indicators. Nevertheless, Cadorna still did not believe. that this attack could occur. Right, he remained unconvinced of any imminent danger, suspecting it was merely a ruse by the Austrians to delay his planned offensive on the Isonzo, which also did make sense to an extent. It's just a matter of degree, right? And that's the level of unpredictability of war, how you can put the enemy sort of condition of asymmetry without making him understand that, which is difficult to achieve, but in fact is hardly ever, like just winning hands down, right? There was, however, one thing that Cadorna understood here that Brusati hadn't. That is to say, that in his observations of the front, he realized that the latter commander had interpreted his orders Cadorna's orders with excessive latitude. So he decided to relieve him of command, replacing him with General Guglielmo Pecori Giraldi. And this new commander had thus only a week, right, before the attack would start, to acclimate himself, and the enemy would again descend upon the mountains. He opted to leave the First Army in its current position, where the time did not permit a further withdrawal. The Austro-Hungarian battle plan was straightforward. Given the circumstances, it was allowed to be like the two armies were to be deployed one behind the other. As we've seen, like one had to break through, the other were essentially reserves. The 11th and the 3rd Army had, respectively, both 7 divisions, and the 11th had to break through, the 3rd had to inject reserves into the gaps into the enemy. They would have hopefully been created into the enemy lines. The right flank of this formation was constituted by the 8th Corps, which was to advance from Rovereto through the Arsa Valley, targeting the Fugazza Plan pass and moving onward to Schio, aiming for Thiene. In the center, 2 corps would operate. The 20th, positioned between Lavarone and Luserna, that was to traverse the Asiago Plateau, and the Astico Valley, targeting Arsiero and Thiene, while the 3rd Corps would cross the Vezzena Pass, advancing towards Asiago. Lastly, the 17th Corps, that was part of the 3rd Army, though, would initiate its movement from Borgo, navigating the Sugana Valley, the Sugana Tal, and following the path of the Brenta River up to Cismon. So it's basically you have these parallel lines of advance that do not actually plan much else but essentially a frontal attack, which is, of course, important to deliver a blow, but is, as we'll see now, not allowing for encircle method. Again, the geographic features would naturally much reduce any of these more complex maneuvers, and in fact, as we'll see now, that the situation would really turn in a monstrous way for both contenders, for anything more sophisticated to be than plain butchery and fighting over these desolated lands. But it's something that, in perspective, would diminish the effectiveness of the Austro-Hungarian offensive. May the 15th, 1916. At 6 a.m., the Austro-Hungarian artillery begins its destructive attack on the primary Italian fortifications. 120 pieces of heavy artillery with calibers, as we've seen, ranging from smaller were 24 to 42 centimeters, unleashed a relentless barrage. If any surprise was obtained, like by this point, it was clear what was going on. It was the unleashment of a full onslaught. Within 3 hours, in fact, of intense fire, these batteries transformed the landscape of the highlands, creating deep craters in the ground up to 8 meters deep, and sending lethal rock fragments flying over considerable distances. Right? Imagine this from the Italian perspective. Such a terrible ground to dig in for defense, and having these veritable stone shells like thrown just by the sheer bombardment, these monster pieces, it's tough, right? And you know what's coming next, by the way. After an hour's pause aimed at a reconnaissance of the effect of the bombardment on the Italian position, the Austro-Hungarian infantry was given green light for the assault that commences, in fact, at 10 a.m. The shock of the bombardment had rendered the Italian troops in the first line of defense ineffective. Right? Some units had been utterly obliterated by this massive firepower. Others had surrendered, disoriented, shocked by the shelling. This is something we've seen also the Battle of Verdun, the French side, with that German firepower concentration. It was, again, remember, there is a parallelism here between the German and the Austro-Hungarian doctrines in the same way during offensive. Yet a few Italians fought with a resilience that astonished the Austro-Hungarians. I mean, these were, again, it's difficult to describe here properly the Italian character, but some of these troops were really as... you think this recently unified country was thus, sort of difficult to move all together, to coordinate, to unite, but the individual resilience and courage and determination and that even that primitive background, we're talking mostly peasants, like people I imagine, I don't know, someone born and raised on the Calabrese mountains or, in the Sardinian hinterland. We'll see later also what the Sassari Brigade achieved there. They're tough people, right? And they are actually, remember, many of these people are actually also born and raised up mountain as well, and they resist fanatically, right? Nonetheless, even these acts of heroism could not hold out for long, because the first line of defense, just like the French one at Verdun, had been really knocked out by the sheer intensity of this carpet bombing we described before in doctrine. The Austro-Hungarian overwhelming numerical superiority, we've seen it before. The Italians had brought this troops further up mountain, and they hadn't managed to dig in effectively. They hadn't been able to concentrate enough troops there, and so now proportionally they were also pushed even more by the enemy mass, which proved in this first line decisive. By the way, the Italian reinforcements were not forthcoming because of all the logistical difficulties that not just the Austro-Hungarians had. The interesting aspect of this battle is that retreat was not an option, because we have seen that there wasn't actually an effective rare line of defense to fall back on. So this puzzled the same Italian officers, for example, because they received no orders. They had no clear direction in which to fall back. And so in many ways, some realized that they had just to stand their ground or die, which is, as we were saying before, in the Savo, in the Piedmontese, now Italian doctrine, pretty much what was expected in any case from this men. Imagine what you've seen in the relentless, bloody Isonzo offensives. Now, on the defensive, the same exact treatment, right? It's ruthless, brutal, but it is, to an extent, as harsh as it sounds, for trench warfare, exactly actually what was needed. Cadorna had underestimated the enemy for sure. But on this occasion, it's rather the Austro-Hungarians that had gone too far in misjudging Cadorna and the same Italian troops. The Italian commander-in-chief was, and this is where the best of his character came out. Yes, rigid, inflexible, but also calm, resolute, centralized. Like he wanted to control literally everything, right? So this can paralyze things in a sense, and it making you lose opportunities, especially in movement warfare. But in defense, inflexibility can be actually a big deal. While, especially in this specific theater, because remember, like if you break through here, you actually make the entire Italian front collapse. And so there weren't options, right? While Cadorna's character had significantly contributed to the current dire situation, it also enabled him to navigate his way out of it. As panic spread around him, because remember that this is the harshest moment of the onslaught, this is exactly where everything is going to crumble under your feet. Von Clausewitz describes this in a brilliant way in the Falkrieg, and so that's where the actual commanders is seen, right? Also, public opinion in Italy here, it was rocked by the invasion of what was called the sacred soil, the fatherland. And in spite of this, Cadorna remained composed. He was that cold of a man, practical, like precise in many ways. He was good, focusing on his duties and responsibilities, because it was all on him. Always remember this when look at the butcher's myth, that these men had everything on their shoulders, everything, right? Cadorna took direct command of the front, reorganized defenses, issued orders to form a new ad hoc Fifth Army, right, to back up the first, which was carried out by reallocating the best units from the Isonzo front, which evidently now had become sort of a minority, especially in an offensive sense, given that you had to defend instead, as well as other regions of Italy, including the overseas dominions of Libya and Albania. The Italian logistical apparatus performed remarkable feats. In this, like, if you look at what the Italians achieved in World War I, remember before, especially look at the literal saving of the entire Serbian army, what was achieved in the Balkan hinterland and at sea by the Italian Navy, this is utterly insane, right? The Italian military engineers were, like how they pulled that off, it's hardly describable. In Italy, 1916, during the Strafexpedition, they actually perform the same way. They managed to transport tens of thousands of men. Remember, with all the difficulties of, again, a still industrializing country, across, like, just a few days, right? This is insane. Initially by train and then by truck. And in fact, this accomplishment was celebrated from there on by the Italian Army's Transport and Supply Corps on May the 22nd, to remember, in fact, that a week after the beginning of the Austro-Hungarian offensive each year. There's a recurrence in the Italian military. It's important, again, to focus on Luigi Cadorna's background, because there you can I talked partially about him in the video about how trench warfare happened. We will repeat just anecdotally one thing about him, but let's get a bit more comprehensive. Cadorna had become the highest military authority in Italy in July 1914, so quite a moment in Europe. And throughout the war, he exercised as a power that was virtually unchallenged, military speaking. He was responsible for defining the doctrine of the Italian armed forces, articulated in this red-covered booklet titled Attacco frontale e ammaestramento tattico, which means frontal attack and tactical training, but in the sense of, say, that there is a specific semantics in ammaestramento, which stems from mastering. Especially you have to teach troops to behave in a certain way. And so there is this psychologism about it, that as we said before, you have to enforce this discipline on the troops. You have to teach them how to go on the frontal attack, no matter what. This was again shared pretty much by all the other countries in doctrinally wise during World War I. But as we've seen, the Italians had this slightly sort of more ruthless bias to it, and this was, of course, not just his accomplishment. This was a work that he had written way before the war and was still relevant at that point, because they had actually understood that was the main deal, because it's an important strategic concept, which actually is always valid. Von Clausewitz is also very clear about this, that yes, when possible, you have to catch the enemy by surprise without flanking maneuvers, a veritable synergy of forces. But here we're talking about mountain warfare. Like, if you don't send people to frontal attack, again, you cannot fight a war. And people hardly understand it because they think it's madness, and it's actually the literally best way you can fight a war. And in fact, everybody does in the same way. Here, the Austro-Hungarians do the same exact thing, right? But Cadorna was much more important. If anything, we shall make a video about him sometime, because he really he managed to mobilize the entire nation to support the war effort. And it's where really Italy came to an unprecedented test, which was very satisfactorily passed, to say the least, considering that this was a country that, again, had no centuries of political unity in her past. So it's a major feat to pull off. And this was just also a monumental task in of itself. It involved significant expansion. For example, the number of infantry battalions increased from 548 in 1915 to 867 by 1917. Medium caliber artillery surged from 246 to 3,000, and the light one skyrocketed from 1772 to 5,000, which for a country like Italy that was to yet fully industrialize, had just a few hubs of significant industrial capacity by Western European standards, like, really managed to achieve also this a major result, major success. Essentially, Cadorna built an army from the ground up, crafting it also in his own image, in that kind of Piedmontese way of seeing war, incredibly stubborn and authoritarian, so that when this version of the army fell short of his expectations, his solution was straightforward. He would simply replace the officers. Yeah, very simple. If soldiers fell in battle, new recruits would take their place. Just send them into the meat grinder. If officers faltered, they too could be dismissed, and so Cadorna arrived to relieve up to 206 generals and 255 colonels of their duties for failing essentially to meet his standards. And it's not like he was wrong in a general sense. I mean, this was mostly, as you understand, a moral issue. It's not like these men were incompetent, but there was a general sense, as it would happen to Cadorna himself, that after major debacle, we've seen with Falkenhayn, we've seen it with the same Oetzendorf, exactly because of 1916. Government couldn't have you there anymore because there was a general opinion that fueled, as we've seen, the same morale of the nation, not just of the troops. So that was old. Naturally, while this approach was rapid, it was also Cadorna's only feasible option, given the immense scale of military operations across such a vast front. So whoever criticizes this man actually does not understand what they were actually able to do to begin with. Cadorna's tactical philosophy, we said it, contended that by launching a significant attack on a segment of the enemy's position, one could identify a breaking point where further pressure could maximize enemy casualties. This is exactly what the Austro-Hungarians do at this point. If this strategy failed, it's rather like the character of Cadorna would attribute failure not to, of course, to the technology, which makes a lot of sense. Like, it wasn't because of machine guns, it wasn't because of the trenches or the enemy's heavy artillery, but rather to the indiscipline and lack of spirit among the troops and their leaders. Right? As you know, during World War I, significant purges occurred. If you read Hemingway's Farewell to Arms that takes place on the Italian front itself, you can see some of the crudest aspect of this executions, of this punishment. But in a sense, it is right, because yes, there are better ways of doing, and some, for example, British, American officers that eventually would fight, especially in the latter part of the war in Italy, noticed that the Italians had this sort of frontal attack kind of bias that would actually cause, apparently at least, much more losses than necessary, just by habit. This is also a problem stemming from the fact that, again, the Italian army had not stepped into some broader re-edition of the older strategic, essence. But indeed, frontal attacks are the best way to hurt the enemy, right? And so, unless there are, broader opportunities to exploit, which is hardly the case in war, and I think that World War I, just by the mobility of the front, basically, in the West, like, shows you really what's the case. For not talking about the Alps, of course. Really, again, find another way to do it, and go back in time and tell them, because that's there is no other way of doing that. Consequently, as we already pointed out, Cadorna's rigid authority and unyielding will were as crucial to the establishment of the Italian armed forces during World War I as they were responsible for the systematic devastation inflicted on them throughout countless futile frontal attacks, at least if you use the literally proverbial yardstick of terrain won or lost. The Fifth Army, so this Italian backup army, was positioned in the plains to confront the Austro-Hungarians should they attempt to descend from the Asiago plateau while the First Army was still fighting. So the idea was that, okay, if the Austro-Hungarians manage to break through the Alps, that's, pretty disastrous situation, but at least they will be exhausted. They will not be able to literally descend into the plains and to fight there, because it would be nightmarish for them. They would be exhausted. They would have, major logistical issues to cross, to descend the Alps, right? They already have it now because of that nightmarish, theater that nobody would think like an offensive was possible to be carried out on. This all was done, of course, while preparing to launch a counter-offensive against the same Austro-Hungarians on the Alps themselves from the plains. And needless to say, battles raged on in the mountains. The Austro-Hungarians continued to advance, strong of their momentum and their numerical superiority in interest of covered ground, but with each passing day, in fact, each meter itself presented increasing difficulties. This is just like for the Germans. Again, this is the problem of World War of trench warfare, right, at large. On one side, Italian resistance grew ever more determined. On the other, logistical challenges escalated dramatically. After the initial days of combat, artillery ammo began to dwindle, which was the case, as we've seen also for Verdun, that the first bombardments were sort of the most important, like the punch to stun the enemy, then you have to go at him and more physically. But the case of the Habsburgic Empire was, as we've seen, more particularly complicated compared to the German empires, given that the latter was a much bigger and, say, industrialized country as a whole, while the meager resources of the Austro-Hungarians really did not allow artillery ammunition depots to be replenished that easily. A scarcely industrialized country to begin with. So even if sufficient munitions had been available for continued bombardments, the front lines had advanced beyond the effective range of the heavy artillery. It was also the most difficult to relocate and position on the rugged terrain of the highlands. The more mobile calibers, which could keep pace with the infantry, vied for the scant supplies that could be transported along the mountain paths. They were quite impervious in many ways. So, as you understand, like especially from a logistical point of view, things were getting pretty dire. The choice was also stark. Either the cannons would fall silent, or the soldiers would have to survive on the hard biscuits in their packs until those ran out. In other words, either artillery or soldiers, and this is not a good option because you need the both of them in this type of industrial warfare. Predictably, the thing would escalate at so many levels. First of all, into a more sort of hand-to-hand physical confrontation between the same infantries, and also because of the terrible environment. Right, conditions, by the way, were still very harsh. Despite the late spring, the cold was biting in the Alps, with some areas still blanketed in snow, and the men working to dig into their trenches in this terrible ground, where snow was absent. They suffered from thirst, unable to melt the snow for water, as none was available on the plateau, and it had to be transported from elsewhere, which dramatically adds, of course, to the logistical stress. And in this frigid hell, the two sides faced each other with equal, desperate ferocity. Hötzendorf was likely beginning to reassess his views on the combat effectiveness of the Italians. The unexpected resilience of the remnants of the First Army was beginning to expose the flaws in his strategic plan. As we were saying before, Hötzendorf's initial errors stemmed from an underestimation of both the enemy and the environmental conditions, which in turn impacted, strategy and logistics. The anticipated breakthrough and advance into the Venetian plain should have been executed much more swiftly if you wanted to make the Italian front to collapse. This preempted Cadorna's improvised countermeasures for success. So galvanizing instead the difficulties from the Austro-Hungarian side of the mountains. To facilitate this, the 9 German divisions requested by Hötzendorf could have proven beneficial indeed. However, one should consider the logistical issues still. You may have, yes, this fresh troops sent into the fray, but will you be able to actually supply them and to make them combat effective in that crammed, hellish, blood-stained, mountain ground? It's really a challenge. And this difficulty was to escalate disproportionately, actually much more than what you see on the Western Front, because on the Western Front, at least you had if not a flatland, but still, there wasn't this problem of making troops cross, especially in the rear lines. In here, everything was much more difficult for the offense, and so this problem could not be resolved either. So there was a fundamental flaw in the overall Austro-Hungarian strategy. The 4 nearly parallel and independent lines of attack that we highlighted before indicated the fact that there was, after all, a serious indecision leaving the success of such a large-scale operation to chance. When you plan this, of course, like mass operation or any, we've seen it also in medieval battles for that matter. Like, if you really want to secure, say, at least the possibility even of enacting a decisive victory, you must at least contemplate something more articulate as a plan, again, a flank attack or whatever. Here, it's not that the Austro-Hungarians were bad at their job. At least, as we've seen, Hötzendorf had really misassessed a lot of this, but the idea is either you break or you primitively push, right? And this is very much probably the only way to go. We've seen it also from a doctrinal point of view from both sides, during World War I in general. But for such an ambitious operation, you would have really wanted something more articulate, right? So in retrospect, when you look at this offensive, there were simply too few troops, too weak, and too indecisive to achieve the objective. The fighting is really something. However, we shall get in other videos in some greater detail for all these major World War I scenarios, because again, one thing is talking about such battles that some people don't even know they existed. It's the level in general, but like looking also at the actual engagements at a smaller scale, and what they meant, like what the sacrifice of so many young men brought, right, for specific decisions, for actual, for fighting for each meter of this land. As we said, the mountains were stained with blood, right? The whole Italy watched with dismay as the enemy advanced. Between May the 27th and the 28th, the Austro-Hungarians had reached and surpassed Arciero and Asiago, the latter which was again razed to the ground by bombings, by artillery, coming into sight of the last spurs of the plateau. In other words, the Italians were about to be thrown off the mountains, which, as we've seen, would have probably not brought to an Austro-Hungarian breakthrough into the Italian plains by that point, considering all the Italian reserves that had been, extraordinarily put together in such a short time. But surely those mountains positions would have provided with this, quite greater advantage as a looming threat over, in fact, the same Italy. And so this was really an existential fight, right? We sort of forget these episodes of the war were really, again, one even relatively minor shift could really change the course of everything. That tells you how, really crazy history is in many ways. On the Italian left flank during those same days, because remember, this is how when the offensive is being blown, so it's in the heat of the greatest Austro-Hungarian push. The invaders repeatedly attacked the Buole Pass, the capture of which would have opened the Lagarina Valley, leading to Verona, right? So the major center, the most important center in the northeast, aside from Venice, that, however, is on the lagoons. On the right, however, the Austrians were halted at Ospedaletto, a town in the Sugana Valley, the Sugana Tad, transformed into a veritable fortress by the Italians. Cadorna believed the moment was ripe for a counterattack, because objectively, the Austro-Hungarian momentum was being exhausted and the enemy forces were being bogged down. So on June the 2nd, the Italians launched fresh units of the 5th Army at the center of the plateau. The outcome is equally impressive because the Austro-Hungarian resistance manages to hold these fresh troops sent by the Italians up mountain. Nevertheless, there was a strategic significance for this effort, because Cadorna had in the meanwhile requested and obtained from the Russians to advance their resumption of offensive operations exactly on June the 4th. So this placed the Austro-Hungarians in a very dire situation. It was like a countdown. They were perfectly aware of, essentially, those 2 days of advance were meant to demonstrate to Italy and her allies that the Italian army was solid and responsive. That not just they had managed to stop this major Austro-Hungarian offensive, but they had been able to counterattack even, and essentially capable of winning with her own forces alone. This would be a great issue, because Italy would be pressured, especially after Caporetto in 1917. As you know, the situation brought to further support to Italy. That also, there are lots of analogies to that, because at least there was a breakthrough. It wasn't, but say the Italian army actually managed to withdraw, to reposition, as you know, on the Piave defensive line, to stand its ground. Like they did it overall on themselves, but the Allies kept sending more help, because now the Americans were coming. Lots of things were changed, and then in fact were Hemingway's novel takes at the moment where that takes place. But if anything, at that point it was mostly a pressure to sort of strike back, right? And so that's what eventually would happen in 1918 with the breakthrough. In fact, hadn't the Germans surrendered, it would have been the Italians to march on Germany, right? This is an often overlooked aspect. The Italians actually entered like from the side of the Danubian watershed already. Like the major German resistance was in the west, and the Italians were simply to march to Dresden, to Berlin. It's not like fiction. It was to happen hadn't Germany stopped. They didn't have means to stop. By the way, the Italians from there, but that's also a very different scenario. But just for saying how, behind this apparently static forces, of course, you can have things like literally like armies crossing Europe, of course, by that speed, and you can see it, in fact, also in other parts of the front, especially the eastern one, that was sort of the more dynamic. But it's more impressive for these western fronts where, things had been that crystallized since the beginning, fundamentally. And so this was like a pretty solid Italian victory. And consequently for the Austro-Hungarians it was a severe blow as well, right? This change, as we've seen so much in the relations with Germany, that basically began to take things over, because on the same Eastern Front it had been the Germans who had sort of succeeded. The Austro-Hungarians had been taking blows from the Russians even, and basically Austria-Hungary couldn't simply make it, at least to the degree of autonomy it had enjoyed up to that point. The divisions that had been withdrawn from the Eastern Front would soon need to return from the Italian one where they had been deployed. And there were some attempts to break through further, like for example at Montefiore between June the 5th and the 9th. And there the Alpine mountain troops and the Sassari Brigade, it was one of the best units of the war. Like the enemies feared the Sardinian unit as the same level of the Arditi that would be created later in that kind of assault capacity. And still today, it's a very, it's a very qualitative unit that leaves also the glory, like achieved during World War I in particular. And these Italian forces clung tooth and nail to the ledge that opened onto the Venetian plain, right? And in the end, they were actually compelled by the Austro-Hungarians to abandon it, but without creating any breaches in the defense. And so, basically, like the entire Austro-Hungarian fort failed in its objective. The Austro-Hungarians wasted essentially their last energies in the offensive without further results or prospects in the night between June the 24th and 25th. Finally, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf withdrew all his units to more secure positions behind, naturally, that had already been prepared for the purpose. And so when you think about, I don't know, these also offensive stubbornness, but consider what the Austro-Hungarians themselves did in this circumstance. Like, we're talking about a pretty fierce and sort of cold way of operating, considering the losses. The Italians suffered 15,443 dead. So it's basically, I don't know, 1/24 of the entire of the war, entire losses of the war, with 76,630 wounded. And other 55,635, naturally the numbers are relatively approximate to the unit, but they are actually reliable, either missing or captured, as well as 10,203 Austro-Hungarians dead, 45,650 wounded, plus 26,960 missing or captured. So this is interesting because it shows how actually the defenders had sort of more punching capacity, and they managed to break through, in fact, the Italian positions initially with that doctrine, which this is the same for Verdun. We've seen how the French actually lost more troops in defense than the Germans, but the moral victory, and this is also the case for the 1916 spring offensive in Trentino, won properly the moral clash, right? Because they demonstrated beyond the mere military side of the story, but that, let's say, as a people, as a nation, against this historical enemy, they were able to effectively respond, to stand their ground, and to even push the in fact this forces back. And this is also from, again, the Austro-Hungarian side, an important blow, because they realized that they were fighting against competent forces, and so something that they had not wanted to believe until they saw it. And so paying for that miscalculation, in the broader historical European relational understanding. And again, this is the age of World War I. It's crazy. Most people really have these complexes that they are superior to one another, and in part it's true. I mean, the warfare is testing that, right? And so, in fact, the outcome of this sense of qualitative capacity from especially the Central Powers against the allies, these other allies, is countered by the broader civilizational capacities of these. And in Italy, that is meant to have arrived always last, and to have had, in fact, issues with her national unity that was sort of denied by the Austrians, because this had, of course, undermined great part of what Habsburgic power had denied really a broader naval expansion, a broader sense of hegemonic power in Europe, was instead proven wrong by the actual results on the ground. And so this is, I think, very interesting in the bigger scheme of things. I mean, how when you look at history, everything is sort of more meaningful than the mere, score points, right, in terms of defeated, of killed, of wounded. That is also extremely relevant, especially like during World War I in a broader sense, but that in fact acquires much greater meaning when you realize that what this means in the bigger picture. And so what also countries are willing to endure to get through things, and for their aspirations, for their interests. Like the Italians had sort of pretty negative sort of the demonic vision of the Austro-Hungarians, that in many ways there were lots of those stereotypes. Also the idea of the rabble of these people starting coming from the steppes. You think about the stretches, the geographical stretches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's very interesting to study propaganda as well of these times, because you often discover things that are somehow counterintuitive, such as the idea that these peoples really hated each other. I mean, this is strange. I think for many people born in the last generations have been somehow convinced that, again, these were poor people that were just, so pious and merciful. Of course, there are, beautiful stories of, think about the Christmas truces. There are examples of this in the Dolomites and other places, like, I don't know, the Austro-Hungarians throwing an object at the Christmas night in the Italian trench from their own, and the Italians scrambling because it's a grenade, piece of chocolate. And I remember the Italians threw back as a. Well, there are plenty of, these moving stories. It's not that they're not important, but you must always remember that they're exceptions. In reality, it was much more painful, and that you must understand, because that's the actual history that happened. And you can't quite sort of narrate it in ways that do not align with the motivation of these people. And I actually want to talk much more about Italian and Austro-Hungarian warfare during World War I, because it's very interesting. Plus, of course, about these countries and the general. Like, we have to expand much more in contemporary warfare. This is very important. It's very interesting, and with Schwerpunkt, I'm a bit just at the beginning of this, but it's not like I lack, the means to make this video. So it's, it's interesting. It goes step by step. I know that you like it as a, an added variety to the pool, the topics pool, but that is also like necessary for a better understanding of the art of war. I could add much more because it's such a meaningful topic, but I'm just glad I made this video. I hope that you enjoyed this. Really, for today, I stop it here. If you really, in fact, like, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.